There's a famous expression that goes, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Today, we're going to be exploring the ancient Roman Empire. The Roman Empire lasted close to 1,000 years, and like every other empire before it, it eventually collapsed. So in this video, we're going to look at what were some of the warning signs that could have predicted the collapse of the empire, what, if any, are the similarities to today's world in 2024, and last but not least, what did the Romans do to survive through that tumultuous period? What could we potentially learn from history to better prepare ourselves for the years to come? What's up everyone, this is Brandon from Wealth Potion, and when I created this channel, I mentioned that I'll be talking primarily about three big topics: personal finance, macroeconomics, and entrepreneurship. And today's video is really about macroeconomics. To understand macroeconomics, we have to understand microeconomics. You may have studied economics in high school or in college, but basically it's concepts like supply and demand. It's understanding the economy at a micro level. Macroeconomics then is the study of the economy at a very, very large level. And one of the reasons we do this is to take a big picture look, to really zoom out and understand what could be happening around the world and draw some lessons from it. So what better way to study macroeconomics than to zoom out literally thousands of years? And as I just mentioned, learning from history proves to be one of the best ways to do this. Now today's video is going to be unique because we're going to be looking at the Roman Empire through the lens of art history. If you're passionate about art history, you're going to love this video even more. So without further ado, let's dive in. Specifically, we're going to be looking at 6 warning signs that were present during the Roman Empire that could have predicted that the empire was not doing so well. And the first one is wealth inequality. It's a very hot topic nowadays that the top 1%, the richest people in society, are becoming richer and richer, while the poorer people within the economy are either getting poorer or are stagnating, and the gap between the richest and the poorest is widening. This is what a lot of people refer to as wealth inequality. And lo and behold, this was very much present when you look at ancient Rome. And there's a specific art piece that I want to touch on, which is the Villa of the Mysteries. This was a very, very luxurious villa that was likely owned by one of the elite wealthy classes in ancient Rome in Pompeii. If you're not familiar with Pompeii, it was a city that was next to Mount Vesuvius, a volcano that erupted, and the ash and lava basically preserved the city. It was obviously a tragedy for anyone that lived in Pompeii, but it was a very interesting moment from the lens of history because we could now see exactly what life was like in that time period. And one of the excavations in Pompeii was this immaculate villa. Within the villa was a series of frescoes, basically paintings on the wall that depicted a bit of the lifestyle of the wealthiest class in Rome at the time. And this is just one of many examples that shows that the wealthiest people in ancient Rome were getting wealthy and wealthier, and they simply did not relate to the middle class, the working class in ancient Rome. And that was one of the potential warning signs that the empire was not going to last very long. The second warning sign was currency debasement. Now, keep in mind, in ancient Rome, they didn't have the Federal Reserve, they didn't have electronic banks, they couldn't create money by the keystroke on a computer. What they used for money was gold and silver coins, and the way that they debased the currency, firstly, was through minting more coins, but one of the reasons gold and silver became money is because they were rare, they were hard to acquire, they were scarce materials. And so one of the other ways that the ancient Roman elite started to debase the currency further was they actually would take gold and silver coins, melt them down, and then add in cheaper metals like copper to literally debase the currency. They were diluting the metal in the currency, which allowed them to print more coinage. While this might not seem like a huge problem for people that understand economics or have studied any level of economics, it's pretty straightforward that printing more money is going to drive inflation, and that is one of the warning signs of a potential collapse. The third warning sign was military overreach. Now, if you know anything about ancient Rome, you know that they waged a lot of wars on the neighboring tribes and neighboring empires, which allowed ancient Rome to grow geographically to one of the biggest empires in the world. But towards its later years, a lot of political leaders would wage wars simply to drive up public support. They were going on unnecessary military campaigns. Largely, these were wars that were not threatening to the core of the Roman Empire. While the armies of Rome were going on these military conquests, the actual capital of the Roman Empire was sacked. And this is a painting that depicts the sack of Rome by Germanic tribes, which was a perfect example of the army of Rome going into other lands, trying to conquer, while the actual capital of Rome was being sacked. Next, we need to talk about the federal debt. You may have heard this before, but the US government is in a lot of debt. It actually recently just hit $35 trillion. But what most people don't know is that running a deficit like this and funding government programs through debt is not a new concept. It's been used by many empires in history, and the Roman Empire was no exception. And this painting here is called The Romans of the Decadence. And again, it's one of many paintings that really epitomized the excess and indulgence of the Roman elite. Now, what happens when you have a lot of debt? Well, there's interest on that debt. And just like we're seeing today, the interest payments on that debt eats up more and more of the government spending. The government literally has to spend money just to maintain the debt. The fifth reason is moral decay. Now, this one is a bit more subjective. I'm not going to comment too much on modern day, but I'll let you reflect on that yourself if you believe that modern society is morally righteous or is morally decaying. But if we look at ancient Rome, it was quite clear. And one of the biggest, most lavish examples of this was the Colosseum. The Colosseum was created by the ancient Roman government and the rulers to essentially entertain the populace. And this was part of a broader program called Bread and Circuses, or Panem et Circenses in Latin. Essentially, what bread and circuses refers to is free bread, so free food to appease the masses, and then circuses, entertainment. All of this visual hedonism that was really meant to pacify the masses, and it was used by the government to distract people from real issues, economic and political issues that were facing the Roman Empire. And it worked. The gladiatorial games were extremely popular. Funnily enough, a little sidebar here, Marcus Aurelius, who was one of the emperors of Rome and wrote Meditations, one of the most popular books today, he actually was not a fan of the gladiatorial games. And perhaps that should show you something, that a Roman emperor that is celebrated for being the most thoughtful and having written these journals that are still relevant today, he refused to watch the gladiatorial games. He thought that they were just a distraction and too violent. And when we look at modern society, again, I think you can see many examples of bread and circuses that are distracting us from real issues. And last but not least, I'm sure you were expecting this one, political polarization. There is one event that a lot of people associate with the Roman Empire, which is the assassination of Julius Caesar. This happened in 44 BC, so this was actually not towards the end of the empire. In fact, it was right in the middle of that 1,000 years. Rome was a republic for about 500 years, and then post-assassination of Julius Caesar, it turned into an empire. In other words, the republic, which was much more democratic, which had multiple checks and balances for power, shifted to a full-on emperorship, where there was a triumvirate, there was now an emperor. And while there were a lot of events that led up to this shift, the assassination of Julius Caesar was a huge one. Again, I'm not going to comment on the politics of today, but we are seeing a very divisive rhetoric in America largely, but really across the world. The left cannot speak to the right anymore, and the right cannot speak to the left. And this is a very bad sign for moral cohesion and society at large. And if we're not careful, the Roman Empire really bore this out. Because of this political polarization, it did not create this revolution that led to more power in the hands of the people, and actually led to the opposite. It led to a more centralized regime with a single emperor that basically ruled for life. Now, this video might seem a little bit doom and gloom, but I think there is a silver lining here, which is that the people of Rome, many of them survived. In fact, some of them thrived through this tumultuous period. And I don't mean the elites and the wealthy people. Of course, wealth is obviously something that will carry you through your life and is something you can pass on for generation to generation. And on Wealth Potion, we will talk a lot about how to build, grow, and protect your wealth. But today I want to talk about some of the more macro elements of your life that you can use to protect not just your wealth, but your livelihood and your family through any kind of tumultuous period that we might face. I'm just going to list out a few of the things that Romans did during that time that protected their wealth and their lives. One, they lived in rural areas. A lot of the conflict in ancient Rome was centered around the city centers, the capital, and of course, living further away from the violence was very helpful for surviving this transition period. Secondly, they formed communities. Nowadays, there's this big movement called prepping where people go off and live in rural communities, but then they hoard food and they, buy guns and they do all this stuff to prepare themselves for the apocalypse. But a lot of them are not creating communities of people. And that, in my opinion, is one of the biggest downsides of this prepping or preparedness community is you are not going to survive an empire collapse on your own. It does not matter how prepared and how much food you have stocked up in your basement. You need to create a community of people. Get to know your neighbors, get to know a church, whatever that might be. You need to have a group of people that you can rely on through conflict. Thirdly, they built parallel economies. But as part of creating these communities, it was not just a support network, but they literally were able to exchange with one another in this economy. Now, I talk a lot about Bitcoin on this channel, and Bitcoin is one of the ways that you can create a parallel economy. And I think it is only going to get more and more popular as society gets more and more chaotic. Fourthly, they stayed mentally flexible. If a Roman was so bought up into the Roman Empire and thought, oh, this empire will never fail, we've always been in power. Those were the people that were most surprised when the Roman Empire did fail or when the Republic shifted to an empire. You really need to practice an open mind. And this is a topic I shared on the Wealth Potion newsletter recently. We will have some videos on this coming soon. But keeping an open mind is one of the most important skill sets in the modern era. And I highly, highly recommend you practice mental flexibility. Fifthly, practice self-sufficiency. We kind of already touched on that. Try not to rely too much on, conveniences of modern life. And last but not least, preserve your knowledge and skills. Be resourceful. I'm a millennial. I know so many young people that don't know how to do simple, handy things around the house. And while this might sound kind of silly, I think it's a very important part of being self-sufficient is being able to problem solve. Even if that means just Googling for an answer or asking ChatGPT, being able to have agency and look for help as opposed to asking for help will just make you more self-sufficient in the long run. So anyways, that was a lot already. Hopefully this doesn't make you feel too negative about what's happening today. I think there are a couple takeaways that I will leave you with. One, in case it wasn't already obvious, I believe that the United States is a late-stage empire. While it might survive for another few decades or even centuries, it is certainly peaked, and I think the prudent thing to do is to prepare for a potential collapse. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but certainly in our children or our grandchildren's lifetimes. Now, again, I'll repeat what I said at the beginning of this video. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. So while I may be completely wrong with these takeaways and these lessons, I hope that this process of studying history and learning from it is something that you take away from this video. There are many other periods of history that you can study, many other empires, many other assassination attempts. The idea here is that you can look at historical events to learn about how do human beings react in the face of conflict or in the face of potential collapse. And that is where you can find lessons that will carry you into the future. And last but not least, I would just want to share that we should all be grateful that we don't live in a much more dangerous timeline today. Again, not going to talk about politics, but recently there were some events in the United States that if they had gone slightly differently, we would be living in a very, very different world. And so I hope that we can all practice some gratitude for the relatively peaceful period of history that we live in. Anyways, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you next time.